Welcome to the Irish Revolution. This is the first episode of the Easter Rising and its aftermath, which is part of my YouTube channel, The Irish Revolution. I'm going to talk to you about what happened in 1916 and more generally about the period 1912 to 1923, a period where the island of Ireland went from being a member of the United Kingdom to having 26 of its counties a free state in the British Commonwealth, and where 6 of its counties became Northern Ireland. So, let's get started. Ireland became part of the UK in 1801. This was an extremely messy and corrupt process, and let's just say the Irish were never really taken with the Union. Well, most of the Irish anyway. Isaac Butt founded the Home Government Association in 1870, and it quickly grew to become the main voice of Irish nationalism. The Home Rule movement wanted a parliament in Dublin to take charge of Irish affairs. In effect, they wanted devolution, something similar to what Scotland or Wales currently have. This was a politically radical yet socially rather conservative movement. In the 1880s, it became the dominant voice in the island under the leadership of Charles Stewart Parnell, a rather extraordinary leader. In the new departure, Parnell allied the movement with Michael Tavitt's Land League and also made some contacts with so-called advanced nationalists or Fenians. This movement, now called the Irish Parliamentary Party, swept the board in Ireland in the 1885 election and won the balance of power in the Westminster Parliament. This gave unprecedented influence to the IPP. I don't want to get into the details of this too much, as it would require its own series, but suffice to say the subsequent splits in the Liberal Party and the radicalisation of Ulster Unionist politics would have effects for years and years to come. Of course, Parnell didn't get his Home Rule Bill. The party split in 1890 because of a scandal in Parnell's personal life. Parnell died in 1891. For years, the Home Rule Party was in disarray, and successive Tory governments in Westminster set out to kill Home Rule with kindness. Of course, at this time, the Tory Party were known as the Unionist Party and later the Conservative Party. They reformed the land system in Ireland and, generally speaking, did a lot to improve the lives of people so that they would de-radicalise. The various land reforms would, the Tories hoped, make Irish people natural conservatives now that they had a bit of land to protect. By removing the potent issue of land hunger, some Home Rulers even worried about the effect of removing the grievance would have an IPP motivation among the people. The historian Michael Laffin was right when he said that the Irish had their social revolution before their political one. Anyway, by 1910 the Home Rule Party once again held the balance of power in Westminster, and having reformed the House of Lords, they managed to get a Home Rule Bill passed in 1912. The Tory-dominated House of Lords could only delay the Act for a few more years, and it was finally passed in 1914. Due to the outbreak of the Great War, it was suspended until the war's termination. The bill itself, while far from perfect from the nationalist perspective, was the first instance of devolution in Britain. During the Buckingham Palace Conference of July 1914, Nationalists and Unionists met with representatives of the Liberals and the Conservatives. The Buckingham Palace Conference didn't really get anywhere. Ireland, although now to be divided between a Protestant majority North East and a Home Rule Southern Parliament, at least now had a Home Rule settlement of sorts, the culmination of a lifetime's work. But there was growing unease that partition seemed to be accepted, and perhaps some felt that the Home Rule settlement didn't offer the kind of legislative independence that they had expected. John Redmond, the leader of the IPP, was seen as weak, and Home Rule Party morale was low in the face of the Unionist challenge, and more generally the prospect of civil war in Ireland, which was a very real prospect at this time, which was to be put off only by the outbreak of World War I. There were, of course, others beyond the so-called mainstream nationalists. They were called advanced nationalists at this time, and they felt Home Rule wasn't enough. The IRB, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, were a secret society determined to advance Irish national interests. They had successfully infiltrated social and cultural movements such as the Gaelic Athletic Association and the Gaelic League, an Irish language and culture movement. For decades the movement had lurked in the shadows of Irish life, and in the words of the old Fenian John O'Leary, "We cannot say when the time will come, only that it will, and that we must be ready." In any case, their numbers were always very small. In the years running up to the First World War, there had been something of a purge under the leadership of Tom Clark. A lot of the old men were booted out and replaced by a new revolutionary cadre who were determined to strike. When the Great War happened, it looked like England's difficulty would be Ireland's opportunity. Arthur Griffith belongs in his own category, I feel. He headed an idiosyncratic party, Sinn Fein, that were a mishmash of things, but wanted something along the lines of a Hungarian model of a shared monarchy but de facto political independence. They were a small group made extra famous by Griffith's public personality as a well-known and acerbic journalist. Importantly, Sinn Fein, which in Irish means ourselves alone, were advocating a more muscular approach to the Home Rule question. It represented a coalition or bridge in ideas between the more advanced nationalists and the constitutionalist Home Rulers. One idea of his that was to be utilised later was the policy of abstention, ignore British rule and reject its legitimacy by refusing to attend Parliament in London. This is the same policy the current existing Sinn Fein party in Northern Ireland uses. They do not attend Parliament in London to this day. Irish society was undergoing some major transformations at this time. The Irish language, whom Daniel O'Connell in an earlier age had completely disregarded, was making a comeback. Irish literature, both in the native language and in English, was undergoing something of a golden period. Yeats, Synge, O'Casey, etc. They all sprang forward from this period with some of their best work. Ancient sports were brought back to life. The landholding system had been reformed. Ireland was modernising along European lines, and the economy was much more sophisticated than it was in previous years. That's not to say there wasn't some real poverty, however. Dublin's slums were among the worst in Europe, and rural poverty was still pretty bad in places, especially out west. The Dublin lockout in 1913 was evidence of deep unrest and unease, at least among the poorer people. And of course, there was always the eternal Irish curse of emigration. During the war, however, emigration had been restricted, and there was now a surplus of young men in the country who otherwise would have emigrated. It's estimated that Ireland sent around 210,000 men to the war, and it wasn't obvious to anyone at the time that Ireland was ripe for a revolution. Mainstream politics was determinedly constitutional, and while advanced nationalists, by which I mean Fenians or Republicans, were known about, they were by no means mainstream. Often they were considered to be local eccentrics, and this comes out when you read the witness statements of many of them. The 2,000 men who went out to fight in Easter Week, and by the way, it wasn't just men, there were some women too, in 1916, were not representative of the country and were initially widely ridiculed, even hated by some. Of course, we'll learn that their action changed the course of Irish history, decisively moving Irish public opinion away from constitutionalist nationalism to republicanism. It needs to be pointed out that while there was near unanimous support for a Home Rule Parliament in most of Ireland, the North East was quite different. It still is rather different, and perhaps it always will be rather different. The province of Ulster contained a Protestant majority who wanted nothing to do with a Catholic-dominated Parliament in Dublin. Ultimately, Ireland was to be divided, by which we commonly call partition. The Protestant majority was concentrated further by excluding the Catholic majority Ulster counties of Cavan, Donegal and my native Monaghan. Ulster Protestants were very ably led by Edward Carson, whom some of you might know as the lawyer who got Oscar Wilde convicted. Carson was a Unionist, that is, he wanted Ireland to remain a part of the United Kingdom. By the 28th September 1912, 500,000 Unionists had signed a solemn league and covenant opposing the Home Rule Bill, then on its way through Westminster. Some signed it in blood. They really didn't want any part of Irish Home Rule. In January 1913, the Unionists formed the Ulster Volunteers, a pro-union militia which would soon have more than 100,000 members. Incredibly, the British Conservative Party under Bonar Law were also adamantly opposed to Home Rule and were rousing Unionists to resist it, and in the words of the historian Michael Laffan, the Conservative opposition and its Unionist allies realised that they could no longer block Home Rule by constitutional means. They resorted to treason. Southern nationalists had to react to this, and of course they did, with the creation of the Irish Volunteers. A well-respected history professor went on to lead this outfit, Owen McNeill. Seen as a moderate, his leadership somewhat concealed the more militant factions in the broader leadership, if not the membership. On November 1st, 1913, McNeill wrote The North Began in the Gaelic League newspaper on Claidheamh Solaois. It celebrated the Ulster Volunteers mobilising for what they felt was right, and McNeill congratulated them as Irishmen demanding their rights, even somewhat paradoxically claiming the Ulster Volunteer movement was obviously a Home Rule movement. He went on to argue for the creation of an Irish volunteer force along the lines of a similar body formed in 1782, which arranged for itself a parliament in Dublin, often called Grattan's Parliament, until the passing of the Act of Union years later. Padraig Pearse, of whom much more needs to be said, wrote a week later in reaction to this that he was glad then that the North has begun. I am glad that the Orange men have armed, for it is a goodly thing to see arms in Irish hands. For those of you who may not be aware, Orange men here refers to the Orange Order, a Protestant civil and political organisation. Irish politics had now been militarised. Bulmer Hobson was at the time a major IRB and volunteers figure, but he has been almost entirely forgotten by most Irish people in the years since, as he tried to stop the Easter Rising. He was something of a key figure at this time, and he allowed the Irish volunteer movement to be subsumed into the larger Home Rule movement under John Redmond, fearing a split in the organisation as the broader rank and file of the volunteer movement were generally speaking not interested in the more advanced nationalist methods. The veteran Fenian Tom Clark never forgave him for this. The Curragh Mutiny of 20th of March 1914 greatly boosted support for the Irish volunteers. British Army officers based in Curragh, County Kildare, many of whom were Irish Protestants with Unionist convictions, let it be known that they would refuse any order where they would be sent north to enforce Home Rule in Ireland against the wishes of Unionists there. This open defiance of the Westminster government made it clear that partition of the island would eventually have to take place in the event of Home Rule for Ireland. Getting weapons was another concern. In April 1914, the Ulster Volunteers pulled off a major coup, landing nearly 50,000 rifles and 3 million rounds of ammunition into the Ulster ports of Larne, Bangor and Donaghadee. The nighttime operation was carried out with great competence. Even though the quality of the mostly old Italian rifles was debatable, the effect in Irish nationalist opinion was electrifying. Regardless of the reality, it certainly seemed like the police did little to interfere with the operation. Recruitment into the nascent Irish volunteers ballooned from 27,000 in April to 130,000 by the end of May, reaching 180,000 by the summer. The Irish volunteers, in an operation spearheaded by our old friend Bulmer Hobson, landed 1,500 rifles and 49,000 rounds of ammunition in Howth, North Dublin in July. The weapons arrived at daytime, carted over in 2 small sailboats. Unlike in Ulster though, the Dublin Metropolitan Police were not prepared to tolerate 1,500 rifles landing within a day's march of the capital. There was a tussle in Clontarf between some volunteers and the police. The police got their hands on a few rifles and a few shots were fired, immediately labelled the Battle of Clontarf, and thus echoing a famous encounter a millennium before. The British troops made their way back to barracks as they were hectored and pelted with stones in Bachelor's Walk in Dublin. They halted and fired at the crowd, killing 3 immediately, and another died from his wounds later. As you can imagine, this inflamed nationalist opinion even further. With both sides in Ireland militarised and arming themselves, and with the British Army looking like it would not intervene to enforce the law, civil war looked imminent. But just as tensions were threatening to boil over in Ireland, international events intervened as the Great War broke out on July 28, 1914. Unionists joined the British Army in huge numbers in a splurge of patriotism. The constitutionalists found themselves in a tricky situation. The Home Rule Party had achieved their great object, but now had to wait until the end of the war to implement it. Remember, at the time they all thought it would be over by Christmas. Oh, hindsight. Redmond, in an effort to win good favour in London, suggested that the Irish volunteers should secure the defence of Ireland, freeing up British soldiers based there to go to serve in Belgium and France. He later went on to fully endorse Irish participation in the war. The vast majority of Irish volunteers sided with Redmond in the ensuing split. This group went on to call themselves the National Volunteers. A minority controlled the Irish Volunteers. In Ireland as a whole, the anti-war volunteers had around 13,000 men, compared to around 175,000 Redmondite volunteers. Ironically, this split, which must have seemed at the time to be catastrophic, made controlling the movement by the IRB far easier. The volunteers adopted a constitution, and while the moderate yet anti-war Owen MacNeill remained in charge, he was surrounded by IRB men. In the next episode, I'm going to go into more specifics regarding preparations, or lack thereof, for the Rising, Roger Casement and the German mission, Padraig Pearse, James Connolly, and much more. Thanks for watching. Please follow me on Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Click those links and subscribe. Thank you so much.